It's the week ending Saturday the 25th of September, and this is The Week Unwrapped. In the past 7 days, we've seen energy companies going bust in the face of Britain's gas price crisis, thousands of people evacuated after the first volcano eruption on La Palma in 50 years, and the death of former England striker Jimmy Greaves at 81. But we're here to bring you some stories that passed under the radar this week. Big news not making headlines right now, but with repercussions for all our lives. I'm Olly Mann, and let's unwrap the week. And joining me today from the week's digital team is Kari Wilkin and the boss man, Holden Frith. And we also welcome back the freelancer who puts the banter in Suchandrika Chakrabarti. It's Suchandrika Chakrabarti. Kari, you're kicking us off today. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
Why is science lacking a key body of evidence?
First of all, we know that the immune system affects sex hormones, and sex hormones affect the immune system. And of course, it's your sex hormones that are running your periods. So if we give your immune system a big shock, whether we're giving it to you via, a vaccine or because you've actually got infected, you might see changes in those hormones, which will change perhaps when or how you bleed.
Reproductive immunologist Dr. Vicky Mail speaking to BBC News in the summer. Kari, if we can all put to the back of our minds the fact that this expert in women's reproductive health is called Dr. Mail, what was she telling us? So
Mail, as you say, very confusingly named, has recently published a report in the British Medical Journal pointing out this link and saying, look, it's plausible and should be investigated. Apparently, around 35,000 reports of post-jab menstrual disorders have been recorded by the UK medicine regulators on Yellow Card scheme, which is basically a scheme for reporting adverse reactions to all sorts of drugs.
And those only get reported, presumably, once women who are suffering with this change in their menstrual cycle go to a GP, and then the GP follows the correct procedure and fills in the card. So there may be many more thousands of women who haven't.
Exactly. And if you have a look at online forums, for example, there's a lot of chat going on online among women who are concerned about these sort of things. So this is probably just the tip of the iceberg. So yes, arguably, of the millions of women in the UK alone who've had the various COVID jabs, this is a very tiny proportion, but it is still significant, and yet it hasn't been investigated. The UK medicine regulator has basically ruled out a link, and possibly that's down to fears that it could fuel vaccine hesitancy. But people like Mail argue that, in fact, gaslighting women, just dismissing these fears, is doing the exact opposite, that this is fueling conspiracy theories, and women aged 16 to 29 are already among the groups most likely to refuse the jab.
And on that point specifically, Holden, this issue about kind of fuel to the fire for conspiracies, there does seem to be, you don't have to dig very deep into comments on online articles, do you? There does seem to be a lot of people who are saying, it's not just a blood clot, let's talk about it. It's not just an issue being reported anecdotally, let's talk about it. And a feeling that journalists, that the mainstream media aren't reporting side effects properly because they're worried about vaccine hesitancy.
Yeah, and I think there is an understandable caution about talking about side effects for vaccines in general and this particular vaccine. Because I think most people, and particularly most journalists, are wary that they might end up fueling the anti-vax movement with what often starts out sounding like anecdotal reports that are quite hard for non-experts to put into context. But yeah, I do agree that I think in this case where there's quite a substantial body of reports of mild to moderate side effects amongst women and affecting menstrual cycles, that they may have got less attention than perhaps they deserved as a result of that reluctance, even if they are still quite rare in proportion to the number of vaccines that have been administered overall.
But Kari, this is your story of the week because you want to make a wider point about women in scientific research generally.
Yeah, so Mail, she's saying, look, experts believe there are no long-term effects from the COVID vaccine in terms of that these changes usually only last for 1 to 2 menstrual cycles, and there's no evidence whatsoever of long-term risk to fertility. But she's saying, look, why this needs to be investigated. There are multiple reasons, partly to tackle vaccine hesitancy, but also because all of this, it just taps into the lack of research generally into women's health in science. Just going back to the vaccine, vaccines, doctors have been suggesting that vaccines can affect periods for decades. In 1913, a US doctor published a report about how typhoid vaccines appeared to affect menstruation, for example, and yet this has been ignored. And across the board, women have historically been left out of clinical trials because of possible menstrual cycle effects and the view that, our mysterious bodies, the hormonal fluctuations make them too difficult to study, and there are too many variables. So you've got this crazy situation where science is saying, right, we don't understand the female body, so we're not going to include you in clinical trials, and therefore we don't understand the female body. And we've just sort of got to this point where the male body has become the default and the female body is the other, which is potentially very dangerous.
But Suchandrika, there is another reason why in the early stages of scientific research women have been excluded, which is, it's basically what happened to the thalidomide children, isn't it? There may be babies in utero who would suffer if women were involved in trials. There might be effects on female reproduction which we don't understand, and people don't want to cause those side effects unwittingly.
Yeah, there's traditionally been a bit of a fear of including women of childbearing age in drug trials. So essentially the world of clinical research has kind of excluded people who are pregnant or could be pregnant. And that, again, as Kari said, kind of leads to this vicious cycle of, well, then we don't know what the effects are, and then we don't include them. And then if they do get a dosage, it might not be the right dosage. With COVID-19, there was a lot of hesitancy around giving the vaccine to women who are pregnant. Lots of changes in terms of how long you should be waiting if you're trying to get pregnant. Just lots of different kinds of information. I knew from my friends who are even doctors, they were really concerned when they were trying to get pregnant around getting the vaccine and what to do in terms of their jobs and trying to keep other people safe. And actually, there's much more evidence we've now found that COVID-19 is much more deadly for people who are pregnant if they're not vaccinated. So it's a much better idea to be vaccinated and to make sure that you're safe. And so there was a survey of 9,000 pregnant women by the UK campaigning group called Pregnant Then Screwed. And they said that 3/4 of their respondents were very anxious about the easing of COVID-19 restrictions because they were pregnant and they hadn't had the vaccine yet. So actually the testing around people who are pregnant and the COVID-19 vaccine happened very late. It was only sort of starting in July this year, which is, quite far into the vaccine rollout. And so that doesn't seem like it was approached in the best way, and it hasn't really allayed fears as early as it could have done.
Yeah, I suppose the danger, Holden, is if you don't involve women in the trial stages, then when the drug is rolled out based on the evidence of men and other groups, you're actually putting women in danger when it's a reality, which is worse. They're a guinea pig completely unwittingly.
Yeah, and I was surprised to see that until relatively recently, women had been excluded from clinical trials altogether. A lot of the sort of clinical trials in the sort of first 2/3 of the 20th century were men only, and I think some of that was for the reasons that Kari outlined of the sort of mostly male medical profession being either baffled by or possibly even slightly repulsed by the female body in certain circumstances. But I think there was also an element of a kind of well-meaning, maybe slightly patrician view that women are more delicate, we have to protect them from this experimental form of medicine, which you can understand to a certain extent. But of course, as you say, this ends up meaning that half the population is then subjected to a drug that hasn't been tested on them and maybe either less safe or actually just less effective or incorrectly dosed. That's one of the things I learned in researching this story, is just how differently the female body can process drugs, not only because on average women are smaller than and lighter than men, but also their kidneys work more slowly. They have different enzymes in their digestive system. And that can mean that with some drugs, that may mean that the optimum dose for women may be half what it is for men. And if you don't have women well represented in clinical trials, that means that the headline result is going to be quite misleading.
Yeah, have you got some examples of that kind of research, Kari? Because, let's put aside the more contentious COVID stuff. What is now known that is dangerous for women because it was tested on men?
I mean, there have been multiple studies about how women are, how data clearly shows that women are at far greater risk of diseases being missed or misdiagnosed. And as Holden was saying, and also of adverse side effects from medications. Of 10 prescription drugs taken off the market by the US Food and Drug Administration in the 3 years up to 2000 due to adverse side effects, 8 caused far greater health risks in women.
From Kari's point, there's one particular drug that sparked a study by the University of California, Berkeley, into how women and men metabolize drugs differently. And that drug was Ambien, which is quite a well-known sedative. I think we've heard of it here, even though I'm not sure we get it in the UK. But basically, Ambien has a much stronger effect on women. So we were seeing much higher blood concentrations when women take it. And then even the next day, they were having issues with driving in traffic, with operating things. And obviously, when you have instructions on the label, it doesn't say different things for men and women. So you don't know to take it in a different way. There aren't dosages that are for women. And so it does seem really dangerous to have this drug that's widely used, that still is affecting women into the next day when they're working.
The situation is definitely improving. For example, in the US in the 1980s, a group of female US scientists formed a campaign group, the Society for Women's Health Research, and they teamed up with some US Congress members to draw attention to male bias in medical research. And, this had effects eventually. In 1993, the FDA and the NIH, the National Institute of Health, mandated the inclusion of women in clinical trials. I have to say, I was kind of gobsmacked that it took until 1993. I had naively assumed that most trials would include women basically from the beginning. And yet, as recently, I've been reading up on some of the absurdities of women being excluded. As recently as 1986, and there are later cases, there was a National Institutes of Health supported pilot study in the US looking at how obesity affected breast and uterine cancer that didn't actually enroll a single woman, and the examples just go on and on. And even now, more women are being included in trials worldwide. But as I said earlier, there's still major lack of presence in early phase trials. And researchers often aren't always analysing the results by sex or gender. So, you're not getting those distinctions. Plus, preclinical trials and studies, rather, remain focused on male cells and male animals. So there's still a long way to go.
Maybe, Holden, there's just an unpalatable truth as well that if women's bodies are more hormonally complicated than men's in general, then there will be side effects. There are contraceptive pills, for example, with side effects such as breast cancer and cervical cancer. That doesn't mean they should be withdrawn from the market. It just means that women have to make all kinds of more complicated choices about their health than men.
That may well be the case. I think I was actually quite impressed by the discussion that we had in the UK around the side effects to the AstraZeneca vaccine around blood clots, the more serious, although very rare cases that we saw there. And I think, this is maybe a good counterexample to what we've seen with the discussion about the effect on periods, where there has, in that case, there was an open and honest debate. There were statistics given. There was a lot of good explanatory journalism about the relative risks of COVID compared with the small risk of blood clots. And I think there was a relatively limited effect on people's willingness to take that vaccine in full knowledge of those risks. And so I think, it may be that what we need here is more information and more open discussion, and the clinical trials, perhaps if the previous goal was to have greater female representation within overall clinical trials, a lot of what I was reading seemed to be suggesting that actually having separate clinical trials for men and women might be a positive development, because then you could separate out some of those different effects and have a more detailed understanding of how they might affect women, and how women could then weigh up those balances for themselves or in conversation with a doctor.
Okay. Holden, you're up next after this. Okay, Holden, your turn. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
For a century-old promise whose time has come.
Right now, we're wandering through what's basically an archaeological site. And what's being dug up is a lost laboratory, the last standing lab of inventor and futurist Nikola Tesla.
But I'll walk you into what is the front of his laboratory.
This lab was supposed to be the proving ground for Tesla's most ambitious idea, a wireless power and telecommunications system. He imagined the construction of a global network of towers that would electrify the world, without wires.
The quest for Nikola Tesla's wireless power technology, a YouTube video from Verge Science posted last year, which links to this week's news. Holden, how?
Well, we've moved a step towards that idea coming to fruition with the exciting news, I think, that sometime relatively soon we might be able to ditch power cables, not only for recharging phones and other gadgets, but for all electrical devices, so that lights, fridges, computers and so on could all get their power wirelessly from the walls of the home or office in which they are situated.
And what would be the advantage of that? Before we talk about the science breakthrough that's no doubt been very exciting behind it, Why would I want my fridge not to be plugged into the wall?
The fridge is probably the less advantageous development, but I think, for thinking about TVs, computers, laptops, all of the increasing number of things that we now have to plug in the house, I think, domestically, the advantages are probably mostly aesthetic and convenience, being able to move stuff around, not having to plug in scores of extension leads and multi-sockets and all of those sorts of things. Although there is a bit of a potential safety benefit. Electrical wiring, particularly in older houses, is one of the principal causes of house fires. So if you could replace that with a system that has a sort of single circuit throughout the house, and then all of the real electrical detail is in devices, that could help there. But I think actually the bigger advantages come in areas like warehouses, office buildings, where you can have more automation, more robots that don't have to either be tied to an electrical outlet or spend part of their working life charging.
Okay, and where has this innovation come from? I mean, because it's not Tesla, because he's dead. Who's doing it?
No. The particular development this week was from the University of Tokyo, where a team of researchers has demonstrated a working prototype of a room which, without any wires or cables, powers a lamp, a fan and a smartphone directly through the ether.
Okay, but this isn't a completely new concept or design, though, is it, Suchandrika?
So, yeah, Disney Research, which, Disney seems to be running all of our lives, they've invented a new method of wirelessly charging mobile devices. So basically, if you go to their parks, you can walk through and all your stuff will stay charged for the whole day, like an iPad for the kids, your mobile phone. You'll probably need the map to find your car afterwards. So do you want me to name what Disney have called this technology? Because it's very like sci-fi film.
Yes, please. Oh, I was hoping it was going to be Zippity Computer or something, but go on.
Mickey's Steamboat Wireless. No, Disney have called it quasi-static cavity resonance, QSCR, and it means things like cabinets, warehouses, empty rooms. They can deliver these magnetic fields that when you walk through them, you can charge all of your personal electronic devices.
Okay, but the thing is, Kari, whether it's Disney, massive corporate interest that they are, or the University of Tokyo, significant university that they are, this is not Apple or Tesla developing this technology, so it's not going to be coming anytime soon to our homes, is it?
No, and there are still quite a few glitches with it. The appliances have to be equipped with a custom wire coil receiver, for example, which acts as an interface for magnetic fields. It's a bit like a net that catches swirling electricity, if you like. And also because magnetic fields tend to travel in circular patterns, that creates dead spots in a square room, and obviously most rooms are square. So you have to have a copper pole in the middle of the room around which, so basically circles of electricity bounce around it, and you have separate circles bouncing around the corners of the room, but it doesn't mean you've got a pole stuck in the middle of your space. Plus, and I think this is a key problem, is that it's very wasteful at the moment. You're currently, certainly in the Tokyo experiment, in an 18 cubic meter test room, though a lot of the electricity was lost in the transfer, the delivery efficiency ranged from 37% to 90%. So these are, major kinks that need to be ironed out before this could really be rolled out on a major scale.
Yeah, I mean, Holden, this is a time where our energy bills are very much in the headlines. This sounds expensive.
Yes. And it's very much in its infancy, and I think there's clearly people are not going to want to put a pole in the middle of their living room in order to get rid of the tangle of cables behind their TV. The question of expense, both in terms of installation and how you would retrofit this into the aging housing stock that we tend to have in the UK, but also then the ongoing costs of running it and the environmental costs, of course, of using more energy than we have to. These are all really big issues that have to be overcome, but it feels like this is, having been first floated more than 100 years ago, it feels that work in earnest is finally making progress here. And in fact, the real benefit to this could come with electric cars, and if they become the sort of principal form of transport, which looks quite likely, being able to charge them without having to plug in introduces a lot more flexibility in how you do that. The first step may be garages or car parks having this sort of magnetic force field that would automatically charge any vehicle parked within there. But there is even talk and research and prototypes being built where you could install these electromagnetic field under road surfaces so that cars could be charged as they drive over them, and you'd never have to even think about refueling or recharging.
Okay. I shan't ask if any of us have already got poles installed in our sitting rooms. But Suchandrika, it's only been a few weeks since we were talking about Havana syndrome, which might be caused by microwaves or might be electromagnets. People aren't sure. This stuff can sound quite scary, especially to the scientifically naive. I mean, basically, do you worry about magnets pulsing around us at all times just so that we can keep our laptop charged?
So I didn't really personally, but when you look at some of the research into it, it is a bit scary. So I found a 2015 US study on exposure to wireless smart meters, which emit waves of similar frequency to what you will find with wireless charging. So some of the symptoms they found from the people involved in the study were sleep disruption, headaches, ringing and buzzing, so like the precursors to tinnitus, fatigue, loss of concentration and memory, less of an ability to learn and take things in, disorientation, dizziness, loss of balance. That's quite a lot of really bad stuff. And also it's quite hard to distinguish from a day at your screen, like some of that at the lower levels you could suffer from anyway. But then they looked at longer term possible issues as well. And like heart problems was one of them. So it does seem that these issues could accumulate over time and lead to more serious problems.
I mean, to be fair, the Tokyo team did test their room safety by running computer simulations to calculate how much electromagnetic radiation a human would be exposed to in their digital version of their room. And it met the standards set by authorities such as the US Federal Communications Commission. I have to say, though, the comments from the actual study leader didn't inspire loads of confidence, although obviously scientists have to hedge their bets. But he was saying, we're not saying blanketly that this technology is safe under all uses. We're still exploring, but it gives us some confidence, which, might be nicer to have a bit more certainty about that. But on the other hand, if you're talking about things like heart dangers, the possibilities, if this can be rolled out safely, for, to power medical implants, for example, ventricular assist devices, which help pump blood from the heart to the rest of the body, you currently need a cable that's inserted through the skin and connects with the heart pump to control the unit and the battery pack outside the body, which is a leading cause of infection, plus it hinders the patient's mobility. So if this sort of technology could be utilised to power these kind of devices, the gains in that sense, assuming you don't get horrible radiation, could be massive.
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting view of the future. You can kind of imagine, Holden, that would take about 50 years to properly be propagated, though, couldn't you? Because you wouldn't want to rely on everywhere having wireless electricity if it's powering your heart implant, because, what if you step out the car to go to the shop and the shop's electricity isn't working, suddenly your heart's not working? I mean, it needs to be everywhere, doesn't it? I mean, Wi-Fi is not even in that stage yet.
With that sort of approach, you would have a combination of an internal battery and then that could be charged through this technology. So you would...
It would be the Prius of heart support.
It would, yeah. Or like a smartphone where, you just have to be within reach of a recharger to see you through the day. And I think with those sorts of medical devices, they use relatively small amounts of power, so you can keep them going for quite a long time on a battery charge. But those are also the sorts of devices where they have to be most certain about the safety of them, and any potential side effect, any potential irregularity of supply is going to be that the standards are going to be highest. So I think it's clearly an area where there's still research, and it is very difficult to assess actually what the real risks are here, because there's quite a lot of conflicting information. A lot of people insisting that it's very safe, have a financial interest in introducing the technology more widely, but then also a lot of people raising doubts are also skeptical about Wi-Fi and 5G and mobile phones and various other technologies that are generally considered harmless. For what it's worth, the World Health Organization says that while electromagnetic fields do have a measurable effect on the human body, to date no adverse health effects from low-level long-term exposure to radio frequency or power frequency fields have been confirmed, but scientists are actively continuing to research this area.
Yeah, I mean, we've had a taste of being always on with the pandemic to a certain extent, because it was hard to come up with excuses why you couldn't Zoom again for the 5th time that day because you weren't going anywhere. But now you don't have any options if you can recharge wirelessly everywhere you go, because we'll be bathed in Wi-Fi and in stuff that recharges all our phones and laptops and tablets and things. So it's a sense of like we're always findable, we should always be reachable and always on. And what effect will that have on work, on the expectations at work, on, our ability to actually ever relax? So it seems like it could have some sort of major side effects that could be bad for us, just in terms of how we feel about being on all the time.
But then, it's difficult to imagine a place on Earth that doesn't want electricity. Even, convents and spas have electrical devices that they would rather have than not have.
There does seem to be an appetite for this, even though, as Suchandrika says, there is the downside of just always being on. But 2016, approximately 240 million devices with wireless charging capabilities shipped worldwide. And in that same year, a consumer survey found that 98% of people who'd used wireless charging said they'd want it incorporated into their next device. So, downsides apart, safety fears apart, there is a consumer appetite for this. So presumably that will dictate where it goes next.
This is a step forward from where we are now, but if we got closer to Nikola Tesla's idea of ubiquitous power delivered over the air, that could be really useful in remote areas, perhaps in the developing world, where putting in place a physical infrastructure in terms of poles and cables is really difficult and really expensive. And, as we've seen with mobile telephones leapfrogging wired telephones, you may actually be able to get wireless electricity to some places before you'd be able to lay a cable.
It's going to really put energy bills up at Starbucks, though, isn't it? They're not going to just be able to have a couple of power outlets. Suchandrika, I'm coming to you next after this. Okay, Suchandrika, you're finishing the show. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
Who really needs a walk on the wild side? Pandas.
Chinese conservationists have officially announced giant pandas are no longer an endangered species. Their status has been upgraded to vulnerable. There are around 1,800 giant pandas living in the wild due to several conservation initiatives. Authorities say the positive result has also allowed other species, including Siberian tigers and Asian elephants, to flourish.
Weekend Live on Sky News Australia back in July. Suchandrika, another week, another unendangered animal on the show. We were bringing back the woolly mammoth last week. Now what?
Pandas, they are no longer at risk of extinction. They are now just vulnerable, which still doesn't sound brilliant. But it seems like there's 1,800 of them out there, and that's apparently enough.
That's good, yeah.
That's a good amount.
For pandas.
So it does seem like pandas do have a bit of an inbuilt issue where they don't seem to want to mate, which becomes a problem for the survival of their species. But some research from the University of California, Berkeley, has found out that if pandas are too comfortable, they probably won't mate and probably won't carry on their line. But if pandas are 80% comfortable, but 20% maybe feel the need to go and roam, which is like, how do you measure that? But fine, they found a way. If you do that, they will go and find pandas from maybe other populations, and you'll get more gene diversity in their offspring. So this feels like a really good sign for pandas that maybe we'll find a situation where they will want to mate.
So actually we need to make pandas ever so slightly uncomfortable in their environment so that they can go off and find other pandas to have sex with. That's the gist of it.
It's what we've been doing to single people for years.
I love the terminology, Holden. It's called the Goldilocks solution.
Yes, and this seems to be a concept that's being applied to more and more scientific research. There's the idea of the Goldilocks zone of intergalactic research, where you're looking for planets that are in an area of space where they're far enough away from their star, their equivalent to the sun, that they're not going to be blasted by radiation, but they're close enough that they get the warmth. So you have that same sort of idea, and I think that more generally you can apply this to sort of human characteristics, human life. Life seems to be most enjoyable, most profitable, most rewarding when we are generally quite comfortable, we feel secure, but we also have a bit of a challenge. We have something that motivates us to get out of bed, get out and about and try other things.
Yeah, although it's not the whole picture here, is it, Kari? Because pandas are living on the planet. and climate change is going to wipe out 35% of their food over the next 80 years. That seems like quite a challenge.
Yeah, and pandas are notoriously picky about their habitats. It's got to contain bamboo forests, it's got to be cool, it's got to be less than 4,000 metres above sea level.
Don't remember Goldilocks saying that.
Yeah, I know. So even if, 20% of the area they live in doesn't have to be perfect, it's still, obviously, that space is still shrinking. But these findings of this new study into pandas and their mating habits has implications well beyond panda conservation. Most large carnivores are living in increasingly fragmented landscapes because of human activity. But if we take a new approach to conservationism, where we're not trying to create perfect habitats for animals, if we try to protect several connected habitat patches so that they can move between them, that actually could be more positive in the long term, and it makes it more doable in many senses.
I mean, Suchandrika, pandas are cuddly, and we're clearly in the "and finally" section of the show, but what is the serious point underlying your choice of story this week? Why does this matter?
It matters because they're probably not going to be the last animal to face this situation. As Kari mentioned, they do have really specific needs in their environment, so they're probably the first of this kind. We know they need bamboo, we know they need certain situations to be able to live, and that it might be that it doesn't need to be a perfect situation, but it needs to be 80% brilliant. But there'll be other animals that are on the edge of extinction that we need to look at their environment, how their conservation works, and if we need to change our ideas around just keeping them in one place or just observing them in one place, or if they also need interconnected areas where they can meet other animals from slightly different genealogy, I suppose.
I think the good news in this is that it does paint a more optimistic view of long-term sustainability for wild animals and humans, even if they're living in relatively close proximity. And with pandas, there had previously been the idea that they needed very large areas of pristine bamboo forest, no human intervention at all, in order to breed successfully. But this week's research suggested a bit of human encroachment actually encouraged this movement and the diversity of the gene pool they achieved by meeting pandas they otherwise wouldn't have strayed across. And I saw another researcher suggesting that this will probably apply elsewhere with other species and other habitats too. And that would mean that having a patchwork of wilderness and human habitation is not in itself a problem if you can eliminate the actively harmful human activities like poaching or pollution or fences across migratory paths. So it does suggest that there's a slightly broader way forward for some of these species than we might previously have thought.
I go to zoos quite a lot, Kari, and when I walk, because I've got kids, and when I walk around and I see the signs and it says, is this species endangered or not, they basically all say yes. Apart from some, monkeys and stuff and wild cats, it's basically like, yes, every species is endangered or vulnerable. And so if the solution is to have human management to some degree, isn't the danger that there isn't then really ever wild at all? Everywhere becomes Disney's Animal Kingdom.
Well, I think this also raises the very interesting point about I hate to be the baddie here and to be attacking pandas, but should we be trying to preserve them or should we let them go extinct? You could argue that pandas are a very hopeless and wasteful species. I wouldn't personally, I love them, but they're not designed for survival, and extinction, you could argue, it is part of evolution. It is. Scientists calculate that about 95% of all living species die on our planet every 50 to 100 million years. Now, obviously, humans have definitely speeded up that process. There's now more than 16,000 critically endangered species on Earth. But there is the argument that, are we just going to compound the damage we're doing by trying to play God? We don't know what the repercussions will be of trying to save some species. It might impact other species. We found that with rewilding. Plus, it's bloody expensive. Pumping money into preservation efforts may mean that there's less to save human lives. There was a 2012 study that calculated that protecting the most critically endangered species on Earth would cost $76 billion per annum. They're uncomfortable questions, but at what point do we draw the line and go, do you know what, this animal just needs to die?
Yeah, and some of those questions don't have answers because they're tricky, Suchandrika, but some of them definitely do. I mean, it definitely will have an impact on other species, won't it? If humans start managing wild habitats, it will have an impact on other species that depend on where the pandas live at the moment and their patterns of movement currently.
Yeah, it's playing God a bit, isn't it? And you have to think about when you have these situations when one set of animals that's introduced into an environment, they upset the ecosystem? Is that something we're doing by introducing all of these other spaces that pandas can then happily move off to and find new mates in? Is that going to then upset another delicate balance somewhere else and then have another knock-on effect? I mean, these are things we'll only see the effects of decades down the line as well. So those are the potential sort of bad outcomes, I suppose.
And final word to you, Holden. I can see you were very animated by the idea of playing God.
I used to work with someone who had very strong anti-panda views, and any time they came up for discussion, which they do from time to time in newsrooms, he would angrily insist that they clearly want to be extinct and we should just stop trying to badger them into reproduction and let them all die. I think that's a relatively extreme position, but I think there is that sense of what obligation do humans have to the rest of the animal kingdom. And I think there are cases where, if you're thinking about rhinos, and where the reason they're in danger is clearly human activity and that sort of direct threat of poaching and habitat reduction. And I think there it's a relatively straightforward argument that we should be doing everything we can to stop that. But I think the broader question of should we be trying to prevent all extinctions, or even all extinctions that are down to climate change, which there are going to be many of them, and I think many of those are probably going to be impossible to reverse because of the amount of climate change that's already in the system. And there, perhaps our efforts are better directed at making the structural and therefore less emotional changes in terms of limiting habitat loss, making sure that the economy is decarbonised as much as possible, and that's probably going to have the greatest net benefit. But it is a rather cold-blooded, rationalist, utilitarian view, and it's not so easy to get fundraising as it is with a fluffy picture of a panda.
Well, if there's any show designed for survival, it is this one. My thanks to Suchandrika, Holden and Kari, our Goldilocks panel, for their stories. Remember, you can follow the show for free. Just search for The Week Unwrapped wherever you get your podcasts, in whatever habitat you're in. I've been Olly Mann. Our music is by Tom Morby, the producer, Sophie King at Rethink Audio. And until we meet again to unwrap next week, bye-bye.